Hello everyone. In this week's tutorial, I'd like to explain the many options of the shading algorithm that Blender uses. You will notice that you start with one big option called Principled BSDF when you go to the Shading tab after you start Blender. The first two options determine the algorithm used for shading, although generally I do not see much practical use in changing it and like to leave it as is, as you get very good results with the default algorithms. The next option, base color, simply determines the color of the surface. The next option after that, subsurface, is sort of like a second surface beneath the main one. Turning the slider determines how strong the subsurface actually is. There's also options for the radius, and the color of the subsurface. There is also, after that, subsurface IOR, which stands for Index of Refraction, and only works for materials that do allow refraction, like transparent ones. The next option, subsurface anisotropy, doesn't seem to do anything useful, so I skip it. The next option, metallic, simply gives a metallic sheen to it, and it is more pronounced the higher up you put the slider. The next option, specular, determines how strong specular lighting is, i.e. lighting that reflects smoothly like a mirror. The next option after that, specular tint, determines how strong the tint is on the specular surface. The next option after that, roughness, determines the opposite of specularism, i.e. how rough and non-reflective the surface is. The next two options relate to anisotropic, which don't seem to do anything useful. The next option, sheen, gives you a glow at the edges, and sheen tint allows you to create a more subtle tint on top of the existing sheen effect. The clear coat effect gives you a sort of coat of paint on top of the existing shading, and the clear coat roughness determines how rough this clear coat is. The next option after that is the index of refraction for the entire object. The option after that is transmission, which determines how transparent or translucent the object is. The next option after that, transmission roughness, determines how rough the transmission surface is. The option after that, emission, determines the color of the emitting glow of the surface. And then the slider after that determines how strong the emission actually is. The alpha slider determines transparency exactly in the same way the alpha slider for PNG does. And then the final options are related to the calculations done for the surface, so the normal, the clear-cut normal, and the tangent, which is the lines that intersect the surface at one point only. Although those are the technical/mathematical definitions of normals and tangents, I do not usually use them on the shading algorithm, as the sliders provided above usually take care of most things for you in a much more convenient and intuitive manner. You are not stuck with only the default Principled BSDF option, however, as when you click Add, you will see a list of different subcategories, and shader is what I'd like to focus on for now. You can add a shader, add diffuse BSDF, which means a rough surface, emission only without the other options, glass BSDF, so a surface that simulates glass, glossy BSDF, or a surface that is glossy but not necessarily like glass, a holdout, a mixes shader, which mixes multiple shaders and then gives the output, principled BSDF, which is what we started with, principled volume, which I do not use because principled BSDF is essentially the same thing, refraction BSDF, so a surface designed specifically for refraction, specular BSDF, so a surface specifically designed to be reflective like a mirror, subsurface scattering, which I do not believe is actually useful, translucent BSDF, which is used to be translucent specifically, but not necessarily shiny like glass, transparent BSDF, which is meant to be transparent but not translucent, so sort of like a PNG with a lower alpha, volume absorption, and volume scatter, which would absorb and scatter the light respectively inside their contents or their volume. Beneath the shader option is a texture option with all kinds of different textures generated automatically for you, but you can also simply click image texture to import an image from Photoshop, which is what I would advocate for, as Photoshop is much more versatile and powerful than the images Blender generates for you. The next group of options is color specific and alters the colors in the same way it would do in Photoshop, so brightness versus contrast adjustment, gamma correction, hue/saturation adjustment, invert the colors, allow light fall off, mix RGB colors, or customize RGB by curves. And the final options, vector and below, I do not believe do anything useful in terms of shading, so I overlook them for now. And the first two, input and output, are generic input and output options for the algorithm that use all kinds of unrelated data, such as bevel information, data from the camera, details of the shape's geometry, the RGB colors of the object, the way the UV map is laid out, and many more. The output, however, is much more narrower and is simply AOV output or material output, and material output is what I would stick with, as that is what is given by default. And material is a well-known word for the surface of the object, whereas AOV, I do not believe, means anything practically useful. One last final thing to note before we move on from shading is to understand how all of the blocks are linked together. In particular, you will see for the material outputs, which is the most important and final step, you have an option for the surface or the surface area of the object and an option for the volume of the object, as well as an option for the displacement of the object, although that is not as useful for lighting, only the surface area and inner volume is. In this case, the principal BSDF linked to the surface means the principal BSDF algorithm controls the lighting of the surface area of the object. If I link it to volume instead, then it will happen like this. You can also click on the top option on the material output to determine what type of rendering software it uses, which is what I will cover in 2 videos from now. Now that I've given an explanation of how the shading algorithm works, in my next tutorial video, I'd like to explain how to animate your scene, as well as organize the objects in your scene collection, like the camera and so on.